Now this is an abbreviated video of the few days in which we discuss the various brain science topics. They're actually spread over about a 2-week period, but I'm going to try to condense it to the main points here in the video. So getting to know your own brain, there's kind of 3 main components that are involved in your ability to function well in terms of your brain. There's your IQ. We kind of think of it as the motor to your brain, how powerful it is. Another thing you have as part of your thinking self is your working memory. How much information can you hold in your head before losing it? It's kind of, if you test yourself and try to see how many numbers you can remember in a series or whatever, eventually you start forgetting the ones that you heard earlier. And then finally, focus and effort, regardless of how big your motor is and how much you can remember or not. If you choose not to or can't focus, none of that seems to have much of an effect. We're aware of about 10% of what goes on in our brain. As we measure our brain impulses with different equipment, we see that about 90% of the activity is unaware to us. It actually has to come to our frontal lobe before we're aware of it, which, so we're learning a lot about the unconscious part of our brain. Caution here is kind of a bit of humor, but the idea that at your age, as an adolescent, have you lost your mind? You always hear from adults, how frustrating it can be to work with, early teens and wonder why they make such poor decisions. Well, when we start to look at the brain, we start to understand why. We're introduced to the nucleus accumbens, or the pleasure center, and based on age and overall brain size, at this point in your brain, the nucleus accumbens is larger in relation to the rest of the brain than it is at any other point. And it's always striving to be stimulated, and risky behaviors will stimulate the brain, which often can result in bad consequences. And also your prefrontal cortex, which isn't fully developed until your mid-20s. And unfortunately, if you look at what it's in control of, if your brain is not filtering out bad ideas and poor judgment and inability to focus or attention, it's definitely going to have an effect on you, and we see that in the classroom and outside. But lucky at your age, your brain's very flexible, like this putty, where mine, as I get older, it starts to get a little more rigid. So even though you may not have as much knowledge, your brain is very pliable and able to take on new tasks well. One thing we all have to look out for is something called bias. Our brains are incapable of capturing the world the way it really is, so that it has to make choices as to where to focus its attention, even without us being aware of it. So there's certain biases or heuristics it will use, but also our brain is trying to make sense of the world, even unaware to us in that 90%, and it will often tell us untruths just to make sense of the world. So actually we go onto Wikipedia and we look at the over 100 different verified forms of bias in a lab. Another thing we're extremely susceptible to is what's called in-group, out-group psychology. Kind of relate it to being a 12, being a Seahawk. If you're wearing one jersey, you might feel different than somebody who wears a different jersey. Or when you're watching the game, depending on which team the player is on, if they're injured or not, many of us feel differently about the outcome, which is kind of a scary thing to think of. We watched The Sneetches, Dr. Seuss, great example of in-group, out-group psychology, so we got to discuss all the components of that. If you've never seen The Sneetches before, you've got to. And here we go, the example of the 12s, this in-group, out-grouping. It can be so strong. I mentioned anybody who's in-group, who's a 12, remembers this moment and will remember it forever. Much like anybody who was alive during the JFK assassination, you just